let's first start with understanding how promising are these comments expected to be for the markets?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for a fairly comprehensive list of what's been going on in the last 48 hours. But I would like to add two other items of importance to investors to your list. The first was the announcement 2 days ago that the US Treasury has asked Congress to remove Section 899 from Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill. This was the section which was going to allow the US to impose punitive taxes on portfolio interest. So that's a pretty important positive for investors potentially. And the second issue was Donald Trump renewing his attacks on Federal Reserve Chair yesterday, and basically not announcing a successor, and no sign of that at the moment, but saying yet again that interest rates were too high and he wanted a 2.5 percentage point cut to interest rates. So investors have got all this stuff to sort out. And in many respects, in the short to medium term at least, the Supreme Court's, in my view, unsurprising ruling of yesterday is the least impactful in the short term, but potentially very significant in the long term. Now, no pun intended, the jury is out on the implications of restricting immigration and indeed deportations on the labour market in the US and therefore on inflation. And let's keep in mind too that Donald Trump has said publicly that he intends to try to exempt the agricultural sector and the construction sector from his crackdown on undocumented migration. How he could do that in practice is hard to imagine, but that's what he said. Nevertheless, if we consider the medium term, there is a lot of well-documented economic paperwork suggesting that in a population which would be declining were it not for immigration, which is the case in the US, the labour market would tighten considerably in the absence of immigration, be it undocumented immigrants or documented immigrants, and that this would have a profound effect on productivity. There's a paper by One Wall Street Bank which suggests that potential growth would drop from a nominal 2.2% per annum to 1.5% per annum. So this ruling is potentially significant in the medium term, even though it is not a ruling on birthright citizenship, point number one. Point number two, it's also very significant because it reinforces the Supreme Court's ruling of 1 July 2024, consistent with the majority view in the court, which is supportive of what is known as unitary executive theory. This is vesting more powers in the presidency at the expense of what has been understood to be the traditional balance of powers among Congress, the executive, and the courts.
Get to the Supreme Court ruling in just a bit, Alastair. Before that, I want to understand what these announcements on the US-India deal that have come from President Trump mean. There were some disagreements between the two sides. Do these comments that have come from Donald Trump hint at major compromises that are made on India's end in this deal?
Well, I'm sure your viewers are as good a judge of the efficacy of Donald Trump's tweets and comments as I am. In all seriousness, I don't read too much into Donald Trump's propensity to shoot from the hip. Let's wait and see what the substance is like in the deal. We've had a lot of announcements of deals, imminent deals, big deals, small deals, etc., etc. So far, let's keep in mind that the only deal which the US has reached with a trading partner since the 20th of January is a partial sort of deal with the UK. There's been nothing else at all. And we are now very close to the 9 July deadline. Scott Bessent has suggested that could be extended to Labor Day, i.e. early September. But so far, there have been no deals on the table. And, reaching a deal with India, which is a very strong negotiator on international trade, both in the multilateral fora, WTO notably, but also in bilateral terms, is no easy task indeed. India negotiates very strongly on behalf of its population, on behalf of its workers, on behalf of its businesses. US similarly. So I'm just simply not going to read too much into Donald Trump putting forward the idea that a big deal with India is imminent. Easier said than done. If there is a big deal with India, I do think it will be very important. How broad it will go remains to be seen. For example, going back to the question of immigration, what impact is it going to have, if any, on visas for Indians wishing to study or work in the US, which I think is a major issue for India and indeed for the US.
Since you mentioned the July 9th tariff deadline, now that is fast approaching. And like you said, there aren't too many trade deals on the table yet. So what is the mood really like in the American markets with businesses as well as investors, since this deadline is fast approaching, especially for those that have cross-border supply chains?
Well, I think, first of all, obviously, we saw markets react barely at all yesterday to the breakdown in talks between Canada and the US. And I think that confirms the general view that on Wall Street at least, the so-called TACO principle, Trump always chickens out, bears very heavily on market thinking. Now, personally, I remain to be convinced that TACO principle will hold, given that Donald Trump is now aware of it. He reacted very badly when it was pointed out to him. And I don't think it can be just broadly assumed that he is going to back down come what may. It's not clear how the Canadian government is going to react to yesterday's withdrawal from the trade negotiations by the US either. Let's keep in mind, too, that Trump's withdrawal yesterday was premised on digital service tax, which brings us to the question of EU-US. And notwithstanding the importance of the US-China trade relationship, I do think that what markets need to be looking at most closely is transatlantic trade relations, because the EU, above all other economies, has the ability to retaliate very strongly against escalating US tariffs. It has its anti-coercion instrument. The US has now withdrawn S899, as I mentioned earlier. And there is no sign of any deal between the US and the EU. I do not believe that markets are taking sufficient account of the EU's ability to retaliate against US tariff escalation, or indeed other economies' ability to retaliate. Retaliation is not being factored into markets at the moment, as far as I can see.
And also on the Supreme Court ruling, now this ruling is essentially going to limit federal judges' powers to go against Trump's orders. Now it goes beyond just the birthright citizenship issue, right? It can also lend itself to other orders that may come from the president. How far-reaching are these implications, not just in the cultural, political context, but also in the economic context?
Potentially unlimited. Essentially, as I said earlier, effectively the Supreme Court is reinforcing its existing stance since roughly this time last year on extending the powers of the executive at the expense of the courts and indeed of Congress. And, you know, this is very much in line with the belief of not only Donald Trump himself, but a lot of the people around him, notably the Heritage Foundation types. Now, I should stress that the unitary executive theory is extremely controversial indeed, and it has been pretty marginal in the thinking of executives and indeed legal experts, constitutional experts in the US for many, many years. But it has now come very much to the fore. And I think not only is this going to have a major impact on freeing Donald Trump to pursue his agenda more strongly than he has been able to date, thanks to the actions of federal courts. It's also going to be a ruling which is not going to be revoked once Donald Trump has left office. So it has a profound long-term implication on the way in which the US is governed generally. I'm going to avoid talking about autocracy, which is a word which has crossed the lips of a number of Democrats in particular who have reacted strongly against the ruling. and indeed of the minority 3 judges on the Supreme Court who dissented from what was the majority 6-3 ruling. But to all intents and purposes, Donald Trump will push the limits wherever they are, and it's not clear where they are, which are implicit in yesterday's ruling, as far as he possibly can to pursue his agenda without reference to Congress and over the heads of the courts. Now, the courts are not totally neutralized for one moment. Class actions, for example, could be brought to bear, which would, in principle at least, allow a federal court to make a ruling which applied nationally. But the whole thing has got a lot more complicated. The one thing we can be sure of is lawyers are going to make a lot of money out of yesterday's ruling, because there is still a lot of uncertainty as to how it will unfold in practice and in all policy areas to all intents and purposes, including trade and business, pursuit of Donald Trump's enemies and so on and so forth. It's a really big deal constitutionally for the US.